There's the possibility of electrocution. Do you understand?
Welcome back to Encouraging Things. This is an Arvin 544A 5-tube radio, or as it's referred to, an All-American 5 or AA5. I got it off Goodwill for about $30. As for its original retail price, I can't actually say specifically. Google tells me that the radio was purchased in 1947, the year of its making, if the sticker underneath is to be believed, for $165. I don't know if Google automatically adjusted for inflation, but a more accurate reading states that an employee of Arvin purchased a similar radio in 1942 for $5.12. So I'm going to say the price is probably closer to that. Now, the reason I purchased the radio was because I wanted to make a prop, a Halloween prop specifically, a radio that would play old-time radio plays, horror shows, things like that. The idea being that it was a haunted radio that could only play things from the past that were spooky. Now, I'm not a professional electrician, and I have never worked on a tube radio before in my life. So I don't believe I was fully prepared for what I was going to see when I flipped it over. I knew the insides were going to be a little bit different, and I thought to myself I could just remove them and replace them with something modern, which is not uncommon for people to do. Until I saw the absolute rat's nest of wiring underneath. Then I realized I had to fix this. I had to make it work. And I had no idea what I was doing. So I went online and asked a few people who knew what they were doing. And they pointed me in the right direction. So the first thing that they suggested was I make a dim bulb tester. It's a simple extension cord with a bulb wired into it. And the idea is that you plug the radio into this cord, and it keeps the radio from exploding if any of the old wax caps have gone bad. To do so, I had to buy a base, a cord, and a light. Oddly enough, the light, which is a 60-watt filament light, not an LED equivalent, very important, was the most expensive part. And although it may look like the porcelain base was purchased specifically to make it more antique, it was actually $1 cheaper than the plastic one. After everything was assembled, it was time to test out the radio. For the purposes of showing how long it takes a tube radio to warm up, especially when part of the load of electricity is being taken up by a bulb tester, I'm going to let this run in real time for you.
It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
Once I knew the radio was working, it was time to replace the capacitors. I went with a company called Just Radios that sells capacitors and resistors for radios. I'd never bought anything from them before because I'd never had to, but their minimum order was $25, which was exactly the right amount to get the capacitors that I needed, plus a few extras in case I made a mistake. After organizing all the capacitors I purchased, I did snip off the first one, capacitor C6 at the base of the model. And here's the original wax capacitor, compared to the one I'm going to replace it with. As may have been noticeable earlier, I am not the first person to repair this radio. At some point in the past, the plug was replaced with, I'm assuming, a more modern plug. The cables that attached the old plug to the new one were actually fraying. Shedding some type of plastic. So I replaced the entirety of the cables with a brand new one. Oddly enough, this is a point of contention amongst a lot of antique radio repairmen. Some people believe that the radio has to remain authentic all the way down to the plug, which is non-polarized and thus causes a problem. i.e. you can electrocute yourself on these radios. Depending on how it's plugged in, you can either electrocute yourself when it's off, or you can electrocute yourself when it's on, but in either case there's 120 volts running through the case 50% of the time. Now, because the cord had already been replaced once before by someone else, I figured it wasn't an original, and even though it wasn't a polarized plug, and I didn't do any of the added safety measures required to make the polarized plug I was using any more safe, I didn't like the idea of frayed cables bouncing around inside, possibly shorting something out. Unfortunately, one frayed cable could not easily be replaced, and so I had to rely on electrician's tape to repair it.
Thus solving the problem once and for all.
Sourcing original radio parts can be a bit of a nuisance, and it can be time-consuming. And since I don't have the time or the space to have this radio sit around not working, I decided to replace the knob with one that I made myself. The technique that I'm using in order to make these molds I learned from Craftsman Steady Crafting. And like many of the things in this video, I have never made a silicone mold before. But while I do that in the background, I wanted to talk a little bit about old-time radio, or OTR as it's called, and my first experience with it when I was a kid. I grew up in a lot of small towns, usually very far away from any place that you could get a standard amount of groceries. So whenever we had to go out, it was usually early in the day, and then by the time we got back, it was very dark outside. One of the places that I lived was, I guess you could call it up in the mountains, but it was an old logging town, and there was only one road to get there, and one road to get out. I remember my mom was driving, and she let me pick a radio station. Now, I can't remember whether it was AM or FM, and I can't for the life of me remember what the name of the show was. But as I was flipping through the radio, I stumbled upon some people talking. Now, most of the time you hear talking, it's going to be talking heads, they're going to be talking about politics or something else, but this time, when I stopped, just for a second, I heard a story being told. It was a horror story, I do remember that very specifically. But what show or what episode is far lost in the ages. But it took over an hour of driving down this 2-lane, very narrow, tree-surrounded road. And I was enthralled by this story coming over the radio. It reminded me of the times my mom would read to me when I was a kid. And even though it was a scary story, I was excited, and I was comforted by it. And ever since then, I've had this love for radio plays. And so every once in a while, I'll kick one up and I'll listen to it, and I'll enjoy it. But there's something different about listening to a radio play through a car speaker, or through a transistor radio, or a tube radio, with the static and the pops and the clicks in the background. That becomes part of the experience. And that's one of the main reasons I really wanted to build up this radio, is I wanted to get that experience again, because where I live now, there's only one AM radio station, and the FM stations, well, they only play music. After all the capacitors were replaced and the knob repaired, I was able to test the radio again, and it worked perfectly. Unfortunately, it was at this point that I realized that this was an AM-only radio, not an AM-FM radio. Now, originally I had created a Raspberry Pi FM radio transmitter using a single wire. But of course, this didn't work with my AM radio. So I went online to find a similar design, and I found one for an Arduino Uno, which I also had on hand. However, this design required a ferrite rod, which I didn't have. What I did have was a plastic tube and a length of spare wire, so I made my own antenna. I was able to wrap the wire around the tube about 2 3/4 times, and then I held it all in place with some super glue. Unfortunately, the radio still wasn't picking up a signal, or at least not a good signal. So I tweaked the design a little bit and got it to work. The changed design can in fact be found on my website, affordable.com, if you'd like to try this for yourself without a ferrite rod.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man, and yet as mortal as his own. We know now that as human beings busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. They stand on the doorstep, waiting to be loved. Read by Wayne June. 1. It is true that I have sent 6 bullets through the head of my best friend. And yet I hope to show by this statement that I am not his murderer. At first I shall be called a madman, madder than the man I shot in his cell at the Arkham Sanitarium. Later some of my readers will weigh each statement, correlate it with the known facts, and ask themselves how I could have believed otherwise than I did after facing the evidence of that horror, that thing on the doorstep. Who was it? Sit in the dark now and listen to Lights Out. Hello, below there! I was calling to a man who stood beside a railroad track at the bottom of a deep and rocky ravine. One would have thought that, considering the nature of the ground, he would have looked up to where I was standing. But instead he turned and looked down the railroad line. I called again. Hello, below there! Because the terrible glare of the setting sun was in my eyes, I put my left arm across my face and waved to him with my right. He looked up and I saw in his face an expression of intense horror. Listen to the people of wasteland, you can hear me! You can't stop that signal, baby. That's right. From Megaton to Girder Shade, Paradise Falls to the Republic of Dave, we're coming to you loud and proud in a special live report. But Three Dog, you're in that cool radio studio in D.C. How do you know I can hear you all the way out here in the ass end of nowhere? Because of the kid from Vault 101, that's how. That cat actually managed to repair our antenna relay. How's that for ingenuity, folks? From here on in, it's bye-bye, stupid static. Hello, magnificent music. So sit back, relax, and absorb these classic tunes. Thanks for listening, children. This is Three Dog, and you're listening to Galaxy News Radio. We're Radio Free Wasteland, and we're here for you.
Once and for all!